Hello everyone and welcome back. Today, I, wielder of the Triforce of Countdowns, will be giving you part 2 of my ultimate wishlist for the Breath of the Wild sequel. If you haven't seen part 1, I'd recommend you check it out first because a few aspects build on each other as the wishlist progresses. To recap, here's the outline of what we'll be going over today. I'd appreciate it if you left a like and stayed tuned for part 3. If you'd like to see more Zelda rankings in the future, hit that subscribe button. Also, feel free to share your thoughts down below. All my footage comes from Awesome Face Prod and Kevin ZEF. I'll link them in the description. As one final note, this is just my own raw opinion, and I do like Breath of the Wild, don't get me wrong. Let's get right into it. I want them back. They've always been my favorite Zelda collectible, and spirit orbs don't even hold a candle to them. There are several ways heart pieces could be implemented, all of which are familiar from past games. They could be the reward from some of the side quests, for some of the minigames, and for solving item puzzles in the overworld. An example of an item puzzle is when you use the Gale Boomerang or fishing rod to get a piece out of the tree at the fishing hole in Twilight Princess. There's also one form of item puzzles that deserves special mention. Some heart pieces came from interesting scenarios that involved experimentation and creativity. A great example of this is using Rockscape and Minish to hit the bell in Hyrule Town after a hint from an NPC. The only other good example I can think of is knocking over the chandelier in the Lumpy Pumpkin. The heart piece is visible from the start, but it still requires experimenting with how to get it. Some heart pieces could also be in dungeons. I love the unspoken rule that formed in my mind that every dungeon in Twilight Princess had 2 heart pieces. As one final note, perhaps there could be 5 pieces per container, again like Twilight Princess, to better account for the world's large size. First off, I'll go over some ways to polish the basic usages of the meter itself. I know the ideas may slightly hinder realism, but for the sake of being a mechanic in a video game that is fun to use and worth existing at all, they greatly improve the function. First, climbing should be a little faster and drain slightly less stamina. Overall, enough to climb about 25 to 30% further than you could in Breath of the Wild with the same amount of stamina. Second, Link should be able to sprint a bit longer. Concretely, this could mean an extra 2 seconds or so per stamina wheel. And last, swimming should be notably quicker and drain stamina significantly slower. This change isn't an unrealistic one. Link's swimming speed is quite wimpy for being a Knight of Hyrule, if we don't acknowledge all his equipment, which Zelda games never acknowledge. The second thing I have to propose is a heart piece-esque system for stamina. The pieces could be called stamina petals or stamina shards, something like that. Complete stamina vessels could be alongside heart containers at the end of dungeons. I think that would work really well. The number of heart containers, especially if the max goes back to 20, as I'll suggest later, might be too small to allow for all the great heart piece ideas, and destine many things to have rupees as their sole reward once again. However, with a second system, like this stamina piece one, there would be double the goodies to fill the world. The only potential issue is that people might want to increase stamina as soon as they can, and aside from dungeons, they may not know where to definitely get pieces, or whether something will give a stamina piece or a heart piece, whereas they knew that every shrine had a spirit orb to use as they chose. While one possible remedy for this debacle would be starting with a bit more than just one stamina wheel, rebalancing the system in the ways I suggested at the start would probably make it bearable to start with just one. I'm sure there's a system that would be a sweet spot between the very simple system of old and Breath of the Wild's weapon system. I have a few ideas, but nothing fleshed out, so rather than suggesting major revamps, I'll just suggest improvements for the current system, which I assume they'll reuse. Firstly, weapons should indeed just be generally more durable. They shouldn't be nigh unbreakable, but there's a need for simple rebalancing. Secondly, I want there to be a special story central blade, analogous to the Master Sword, with no limitations on it. While this sounds like it would render the weapon system superfluous, there would still be reason to carry other weapons. For example, certain weapon types could be necessary or highly advantageous, as the fire rod is to Gibdos, for certain enemy types. Perhaps spears would be helpful for an enemy that maintains a careful distance from Link, or maybe a heavy weapon would be needed to finish off a stunned Armos statue. I've heard some people suggest a weapon repair system. That could be cool, I'm not opposed to it. But my biggest wish, incontestably, is that there is some special blade crucial to the story. If it's the Master Sword, restore the glory it mostly lost in Breath of the Wild. If it's a new sword, maybe something from an alternate world. Just make it meaningful and awesome to get, please. I've heard many people express aggravation at constantly having to switch between outfits. I didn't get annoyed by this, but that doesn't mean I didn't take some issue with the armor system. I've always liked it when Link had one consistent outfit throughout the adventure, with some exceptions like the Zora armor for underwater use. I'd like a few sets like that were used during the story, maybe even a couple goofy costumes for fun here and there. But the main thing I'm going to argue for here is that clothing effects can become intrinsic to Link somehow, like Skyward Sword's heat-shielding earrings did. I see it as a win-win if collected status effects could be permanently applied to Link. They could even be turned on and off like the champion abilities, if people desired. For those that love customizing outfits, there could still be a vast number of options, but those like me who prefer it how it was in past games would also be appeased, even if it doesn't make sense as perfectly as the outfits. But hey, it's a magical world. One example would be a bracelet for surviving cold weather. There could be challenges related to an effect before Link earned it as well. For example, needing to brave an area of perpetual heavy lightning to reach a place where he can get something that grants protection against lightning, or climbing a challenging cliff for a climbing booster, or performing a challenge near an area of extreme heat to get a boon for surviving it better. My other issue with the armor system was how virtually impervious Link could become. A Lionel, a boss, or a comparably powerful enemy could probably be reduced to dealing about a quarter heart of damage per hit with the correct upgraded armor set. I know upgrading is optional, but you shouldn't need to hold yourself back from doing things in a game that you may or may not realize will make the game less satisfying by diminishing tension in fights. Armor upgrading is just another spiritless mechanic that blurs the line between Breath of the Wild and any other open world game for me. It shouldn't be that way. This is Zelda. Zelda is not reliant on anything else for its ideas or inherent energy. Another thing that skewed the difficulty was the food system. Once again, unless it was near the beginning of the game, challenge in fights was completely undermined by this mechanic. In the sequel, you shouldn't be able to eat instantaneously, on demand. Maybe you could pause to select a dish, but not consume it right then. If this continues as the healing system, which I'm hesitant about wanting, there should be a span of time required to consume a given dish so that it must be strategically fit into gameplay. The other issue is stockpiling. With this, the food system not only undermined difficulty, but it could do so virtually indefinitely. In past games, bottles held you back from having too many easy health refreshes. These too usually stopped gameplay for a moment, but at least you couldn't use them infinitely. Hopefully a comparable restriction can be incorporated. And to be honest, in all of this, I fail to admit that I have a soft spot for and really prefer the old system anyways, of finding hearts in pots and grass, and from enemies. I'll put it this way, I wouldn't be grief-stricken if cooking wasn't in the sequel, but I'd like it for sure if it was used with less emphasis. I think it's a really interesting mechanic that could be implemented in really fun ways, but I'm skeptical that it's the best for the health system. Maybe there could be the option to use food for all your health refreshes, but otherwise it's more of a recurring side mechanic. Think of Snow Peak Ruins in Twilight Princess. Cooking had a cool presence in that dungeon, but obviously it should be much more expansive and recurrent than that. Cooking could show up in side quests or at a few points in the story, just not in a shoehorned way, while being available to use for health replenishes as well. Just an idea. That's much of what Nintendo games need. Options, like the option to use motion controls for Twilight Princess HD. Transformation masks would be too eclectic and forced to fit into this game. They're dang cool, but we have to reconcile ourselves to the clear fact that not every dang cool thing or every great mechanic from Zelda history could be thrown into a game and have it come out cohesive and functional as a whole. All the same, I was speculating initially about a transformation tied to what I mentioned in the character section on Link, some sort of energy state that he could enter due to that green stuff, with perks and risks comparable to Metroid Prime 3's Hyper Mode, but more fleshed out than that. And again, it's also eerily similar to Princess Mononoke. But as I pondered, I became doubtful it would work very well, and I'm sure if Nintendo has anything in store, it will be better. A potentially playable Zelda might already add a lot to gameplay variety anyways, but it was interesting to think about because I tried to judge the applicability of all the notable mechanics of Zelda's past in preparation for this discourse. Here I go, about to harp upon yet another Breath of the Wild mechanic. I promise I don't hate this game. Collecting a ton of materials was never really something I wanted from a Zelda game, and I think it can easily corrupt to feeling like hoarding, to bogging down the flow of the gameplay, and to making it like any other open world game. But that's a personal bias, so I'll let the material system as a concept pass, since some people really like it, and it's neutral to me in conceptual form. But I think there are some objective flaws in its execution. The usage for many materials must be overhauled. First off, precious gems like opal or sapphire basically have only one use, selling them for rupees. This is especially disappointing when it says in the description of opal, for example, that it contains the power of water. What was the point of that useless tease? And secondly, one of the only reasons to have some other materials, even really cool seeming ones, was for upgrading armor, which I never cared for much, as I said. Other than that, the materials were used mostly for side quests and cooking. For side quests, the system was detrimental because it indulged the temptation to overuse fetch quests. Cooking was more fun, but trying to make use of all the superabundance of foods in your inventory did get wearisome sometimes, in long cooking sessions. All of that makes collecting materials more unexciting, but I realize it wouldn't have been fitting for the level of materials to have been cut down in a world as expansive as Breath of the Wild. I went through many drafts of this wish list without even thinking about rain. It's the least of my problems with Breath of the Wild. But yes, while I like the realism of rain in theory, hopefully there will be an item or piece of equipment that can be obtained at some point to mitigate rain's effect on climbing. On to more important things. Termina in Majora's Mask is the best example of what could be done. Aonuma mentioned revisiting the same Hyrule with different mechanics and story. The reason I don't think this automatically dashes our hopes for an alternate world is that this Hyrule could just mean the same era. The fact that this is a sequel and not an entirely different incarnation of Link and such. It could have been a completely different time period, yet with the same game engine, but it isn't. Okay, but that's fairly unlikely. It will probably be Hyrule again. Here's my take in that case. Firstly, there should be a secondary alternate world that is visited and can be transported to, like the Twilight Realm. My ideas are either a world steeped in malice or some strange world of magic, probably relating to the Zonai. The world need not be proportional in size to Hyrule, but should be substantial enough to freshen and enliven the experience of exploring the world. Secondly, there should be considerable change to Hyrule. Maybe certain areas are greatly altered by energy or malice from the castle, or impacted by the alternate world. That way, there could be new characters, buildings, islands, even landforms. But the tricky thing about the source of these alterations is that it might mean those new characters or buildings would all be constructs of that energy, and would probably have that uniform color scheme, or in the case of being malice produced, would seemingly have to be something hostile. Perhaps that's an unimaginative mindset, but it's a valid question. This is one of my more controversial wishes, but hear me out. I think Breath of the Wild's huge size was often to its detriment. I feel like people close themselves off to criticizing the effects of its massive scale because of how mind-blowing the humongous size is in the first place. Or maybe they just plain disagree with me, but whatever it is, here's my case for a smaller world. A smaller world means more consistently remarkable locations. I know that part of Breath of the Wild's beauty is in its living, breathing world, which doesn't depend on memorable things being everywhere, but I still want decreased filler. Faron Woods and Gerudo Desert shouldn't unnaturally transfer right into the other or something, but that's why I say decreased filler. A bit smaller of a world, with enhanced quality, rather than one of mind-blowing quantity, but with many superfluous aspects. I realize that the Great Plateau is an example of an area that lacks filler. Not everything is necessary, strictly speaking. It could still stay intact as a tutorial if they crunched the shrines closer together and shrunk a few locales, but I don't think there's a need to. Other regions, though, seemed to have some disposable, overinflated, or overly repetitive areas. I say overly because some repetition is natural. A smaller world is also easier to appreciate by being easier to manage. When you have a life outside the gaming world, says the one who compiled this gargantuan wish list, a world like Breath of the Wild's can become, without choice, more like a checklist than an experience. You do want to explore it all, but it's overwhelming to do so and wearying when it's so gratuitously large. Even if it is the same world this time, hopefully in the future the Zelda team will work towards finding that best overall scale. I don't think the world needs to be too much smaller. Even 20% would be a great relief. But then again, even 50% wouldn't be too much for me. I mean, Twilight Princess is basically my favorite game ever, and I loved its world, many times smaller than Breath of the Wild. But that creeps into bias, not logical happy medium, so I'll propose 20%. Don't get me wrong, there was still a good deal of amazing discoveries in Breath of the Wild, and none of this joy of discovery need be lost if this decrease occurred. This is another area where quality should be prioritized. Enemy camps get stale after a while, even if you approach them in different ways. They're especially bland as Link gets more and more damage resistant and combat is more and more of an excessive onslaught of melee and range attacks than anything else, as the health bars go higher and higher. But the weapon system makes it necessary to have places where the player knows they'll find more weapons. So enemy camps shouldn't be cut, just limited. My idea is that there be implicit tiers of secrets or encounters. The lower tier would be enemy camps and the like, which would be encouraged for getting arrows, weapons, and such, but the player would know that they wouldn't miss any important collectibles or upgrades if they skipped one. Because that kind of thing, the higher tier of encounters, shall we say, would be reserved for side quests, minigames, or other kinds of scenarios that heart pieces might be found in. Or in things like the novel character scenarios we've seen in previous games, like the Flute Boy in A Link to the Past, or at fairy fountains. It's a toss-up whether fairy fountains are obsolete by now. I think they're fun. Not the Breath of the Wild ones, though, as you'd guess. But fun is probably not enough to justify having arrow limits and the like, even if those limits started generously high. So they would need to exist for rewards other than just capacity upgrades, like magical abilities as in Ocarina of Time. Anyways, through this, enemy camps would be less excessive, or not strictly necessary even if they were excessive. Unlike most, I've always loved water dungeons and water areas in games generally. This section is about expanding the exploration mechanics related to water. The two main aspects of this are underwater exploration and sailing. Firstly, it would be fitting to the level of freedom in these open air games to allow underwater exploration in the sequel. Some kind of Zora armor could be eventually acquired to do so. The underwater parts need not be as meticulously filled as the mainland, just secrets and things to explore here and there. There could be sea caves, maybe a trench, an abandoned city, or a strange doorway with a puzzle or riddle for opening it. Other than those things, part of the joy of exploring would be in design itself. The art style of these games would mingle perfectly with aquatic scenery for some breathtaking sights. Vivid coral reefs, strange or creative fish, the list goes on. Even kelp could be lush if realistically crafted like Breath of the Wild's softly stirring grass. Secondly, expanded sailing options. There should be more boat options than just the clunky rafts. Maybe vendors near the sea could sell boats to Link, or he could hitch a ride on a pirate ship during a side quest. I can't think of any way to have a consistent boat like in Wind Waker, unless it was summonable through Zelda's magic or some way like that. Now, of course, what's the main thing that creates a need for sailing? Islands. Eventide Island compensated for the absence of stirring islands in Breath of the Wild, but even that was defined more by its shrine quest than any inherent value. It would be cool to see more this time with their own unique traits, as with the prominent Wind Waker Islands or Lumpy Pumpkin Island in Skyward Sword. If the new islands are not somehow added where there weren't any before, the new ones could be in the alternate world or beyond Breath of the Wild's boundaries. Breath of the Wild had some good minigames, but they still didn't reach the level of joy of others in the series. Here are some awesome minigames of the past, for examples, with me unsurprisingly using Twilight Princess as a paragon example of yet another thing. Isa's Rapid Ride, Falby's Flight by Fowl, and Snowboarding from Twilight Princess, and the Goron Race, and Beaver Race from Majora's Mask. While it was a cool idea and a very well implemented toolkit, I feel like the Sheikah Slate wasn't expanded enough like classic item sets have been. Even if the system used was something like this Breath of the Wild concept art and all the items/runes were again stored on a single device, there should be more than 4 of them. New items could be acquired through devices that could download in the ability midway through dungeons or at points in the story. Even with more items, the interface need not be any less fluid than Breath of the Wild's. It could be a circular pop-up interface like Twilight Princess, with an item precisely selected by rotating the joystick. While I'm very tempted by the convenience of having every item from the start, I still prefer the classic progression. This old progression is also more ideal if there were more items, because there wouldn't be a load of them thrown onto you all at once, which would be disappointing when there's no expansion later. Getting them all in a tutorial area to make every puzzle available from the get-go is an attractive idea, but overall, my love for getting new dungeon items trumps that convenience. The world itself could still be almost completely free to explore with the old system, with just a good deal of puzzles or minor areas that required further progression to solve or enter. As far as champion abilities, I think they're also replaceable by items or something similar. As is, 2 of the 4 abilities are fairly uninspired, basic things that seemed more special just because they're called champion abilities. Mipha's Grace is basically a free revival, and Daruk's protection is just 3 times you should have gotten hit that you get a free pass. Now, the other two are a lot more promising, but I still wonder if they're the most Zelda-y. Urbosa's Fury could be replaced by something more like the Quake Medallion from A Link to the Past. On a side tangent, it would be interesting to see a magic meter return. I'm torn about Rivali's Gale. It was very handy, just not necessarily cool. Overall, I think there are other conceivable wind-related items or abilities that would be a lot more interesting to use, like the Gust Bellows or the Gale Boomerang. Whatever the replacement item, it could certainly be designed to double for replicating that champion ability if necessary. As a note, one way to ensure that an overworld mini-dungeon or other independent locations could be explored at a given time without multiple trips is if their entrances required a certain item, and as such it would only be items found up until the point of that item's discovery that were needed in the mini-dungeon. Or if dungeons are able to be taken on in any order, the entrance could require a combination of items and those were the ones required to complete it. There were several items that lost their charm and value in Breath of the Wild, simply because there was more than one of them. Some big examples are the Fire Rod, the Ice Rod, and the Boomerang, not to mention Epona. This was one breach of the old formula that I wasn't too jazzed with, shall we say. None of these were one of a kind anymore, and their specialness further deteriorated since they were simply classified as melee weapons. Yes, it makes sense that all the Wizrobes had an elemental rod, so they all drop one, but it just really took the magic out of the fire and ice rods, no pun intended. The Boomerang I'm more willing to move on about, but it still had notable value in puzzles in past games that it doesn't so much anymore. This is perhaps another design choice that I'm just overly stubborn about, but I do think the value of these things is undeniably thwarted. I want these classic items to veer back towards their old uses, as special items that are valuable for puzzles. I also mentioned Epona in passing. I liked how there was usually more of a story around your horse when it was just Epona, but with the direction they went in Breath of the Wild, I see how that probably just can't work anymore. Adding a multiplicity of horses is just another freedom-accommodating innovation of Breath of the Wild's that would be hard to undo, at least considering Breath of the Wild's acclaim. But it's nevertheless a constant regret for me because it undermines something magical from other games. While a change to the horse system that better suits my fancy isn't that unrealistic, I'm not going to dwell on it or get my hopes up. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and please stay tuned for part 3 of this wishlist, the conclusion to this series. It'll be the one where I give my take on a playable Zelda and lots of other great stuff. Stay tuned, I'd appreciate it so much. Remember to leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more Zelda ranking content, and feel free to start a discussion in the comments down below. Thanks so much and have a fantastical day.